I have the privilege of moderating our first session. This is a part 1 and part 2. So part 1, we're beginning with a couple of speakers, and the topic is focused on breaking down barriers to action. And so these are stories of how folks on the ground are implementing, climate-informed invasive species management. So we really encourage you to stick around and contribute to the discussion at the end of each of these sessions. So we'll have 3 speakers, and then we've saved time at the end of this part 1 to have a panel discussion. And I believe we are right on time. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Cheryl Shippentauer. So if you're there, if you wouldn't mind joining us, and you can share your screen. So Cheryl is the restoration ecologist for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And whenever you're ready, Cheryl, go ahead and take over.
All right, great. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm Cheryl Shippentauer. I work for the Umatilla Tribes in the Department of Natural Resources. Today, I'm going to talk about planning for an uncertain future, climate change, and invasive species impacts to first food availability and access. So kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today is our first food management approach and our guiding documents that help us achieve those goals, and then planning for climate change and invasive species impacts. So I'll start off with just a brief overview of what our first foods are. Our traditional foods gathered by plateau tribes, and traditional foods are what all tribes gather. Each one of these food groups represents a similar species. So Chush is our water, which is important for all the other first foods. So we have Nusuk, which is our salmon aquatic species. Yamash is our big game and other wildlife species. And then Haush is our greens and root plants that we gather and dig. And huckleberry covers all the berry crops. So we adopted a first food mission for Department of Natural Resources and reservation or tribal wide. This mission was developed in response to the longstanding and continued community expression of first food traditions, and the community members' request that first foods be protected and restored for the perpetual use for now and in the future. And so from this mission, we developed these first food guiding documents. So the river vision, which focuses on water and our aquatic species, and the upland vision, which focuses on our wildlife and our roots and berries. And then those inform our natural resource management plans, and then our climate adaptation plan, what I'll talk about more today. So these guiding documents describe desired ecological processes and characteristics for first food resources that propose management strategies that incorporate the CTR's community values and needs. So we adopted our climate adaptation plan last year, and it's 3 chapters that cover celebrating CTR, this kind of background on the tribe, talks about our first food mission and our management approach. Chapter 2 covers a brief overview of our climate modeling and projection efforts that have been completed for Pacific Northwest and specifically for the tribe. And then chapter 3, which I'm going to be focusing on, reviews climate projections for impacts that will affect first foods in the CTR community. So the chapter 3 is the section I'll be looking at is the first foods availability and access. And we have identified 10 potential threats to first foods in this chapter. And so this chapter is organized on impacts to first foods, our adaptation goals, which are community identified. This document was had a lot of community engagement, and so it is a community plan, and identifies the short-term and long-term goals, and how do we measure success of adaptation, and also recognizing gaps in knowledge, policy, capacity, and education for those goals and the measuring of success. So I won't go over all these, but what they do cover is the first is like our aquatic species and water quality and quantity. Then it moves into wildlife impacts, and then into our roots and berry impacts. So, looking at the decoupling of like pollinators and first foods, habitat suitability and migration. So we're going to see this contraction of our first, that's predicting to see the contractions in our first food resources, and then an expansion of invasive species. And so, I'll be focusing on increased invasive species pressure. And so invasive species already threaten first foods that are essential to maintain and enhance tribal traditions and culture, causing dramatic changes in ecosystem by shifting first food species composition, species mortality, biodiversity, and disturbance regimes, which leads to decreasing and eliminating our access to our foods and medicine and other uses. And so climate change is just going to amplify these effects that are currently happening. So I'll focus in on our adaptation goal for invasive species pressure, and it's invasive species displacement management and monitoring. And we develop both short and long-term goals for this, and I'll just share a couple. Our short-term one is coordinate with other land and conservation management agencies, and then one of our long-term goals is continue to implement invasive species management plan, and our other natural resources management plans, and our visions as well. So the first one I'm going to talk about is our coordinating with the other land managers. And so we collaborate with OSU, Wallowa Resources, and the U.S. Forest Service to develop this project is celery and root monitoring. And this is a collaboration between what I mentioned. It's to develop a protocol to monitor the abundance of culturally significant plants. And the information and the status, trends, and health of these species is lacking. There's little or known information about how invasive species are going to impact these resources. Changing fire regimes, livestock grazing, and land management actions will affect the abundance and availability of these forbs. So this work will address that knowledge gap and help us address any kind of impacts those may cause. And so we've got 2 years of data so far, and we'll continue this in the following years. And so our long-term goal is to continue to implement invasive weed management plan, incorporating climate change into our management strategies, our invasive species management strategies. And so we have an integrated management strategy already, but we want to emphasize adaptive management strategies as needed for addressing changes to native plant and invasive species weed coverage resulting from climate change. And using this monitoring program, we also implement a monitoring program where we have a centralized weed database that we've created to help us monitor any of those changes. So it's a kind of a mapping where these invasive species are, and evaluate them over time, looking at and so this will help us prioritize. And so we gain a lot of information about what kind of coverage is it, how is it changing. So this will be really useful for us to see any kind of changes and to address those and prioritize those. And so in closing, I just want to reemphasize that the tribe is a food associated culture. And so we hope with our first food management approach and our climate adaptation plan that we create and maintain a resilient ecosystem so that we can sustain production of first foods that allows us to access those and to gather those so that we can continue the teaching and the learning and the harvest that goes with those first foods. This reciprocity, this first foods promise to take care of those resources. When they stood up, we gave testimony that they would take care of us. And to continue that celebration and consumption of those foods. And so on the Department of Natural Resources, it's our responsibility to maintain those resources for the community. Because without first foods, the continuity of the CTR culture cannot be sustained. So that's my presentation. Thank you. And I've got, since I wasn't able to cover those guiding documents, I have links to those if you're interested. I've got the link to the climate change adaptation plan, and it has all the outreach that we did in the community, and we continue to do outreach. So we're sharing our projects that we're working on, how we're addressing that, Umatilla River Vision, Upland River Vision, and then the invasive weed management plan. So thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to share our work with you.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Would you mind adding those links to the chat? I think some of us would be interested in reviewing the documents.
Sure.
And as I mentioned earlier, we'll have Cheryl and the other speakers rejoin us at the end of this first part one of the morning session for a panel discussion. So you can either insert your questions in the chat or save them for later. And I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, which is Brian Turner. And I deleted his speaker bio. I apologize. Give me 1 second. Emily, do you have the speaker bios available? Sorry, I know you're WDFW. I apologize.
Sure.
I'm very abundantly WDFW.
Yeah,
I can just
we
go
have
ahead.
Brian here from WDFW. Thanks, Brian.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Yeah, let me just go ahead and dive right in. So I'm the research scientist with the Aquatic Invasive Species Unit here at Fish and Wildlife. So I tend to look at all of these things from a research perspective. I'm not going to be talking too much about our actual green crab program, though I'm happy to answer any questions or provide any information I can. But I want to very briefly start off by introducing the European green crab. For those of you who aren't familiar, the European green crab is a small, about 4 inches wide, aggressive. They are very predatory, very combative sort of species amongst other crabs. And they're a proficient invader. They reproduce very readily. They've spread throughout the entire world, basically every continent except for Antarctica at this point. The question that we're going to talk about today is how green crabs are going to respond to climate change and how that's going to affect sort of their impacts and also how we manage them. One thing that's important to know to start off is that green crabs have a very wide tolerance for environmental conditions, so they can survive in a wide range of salinities and temperatures. The adults more so. The larvae tend to be more vulnerable. They'll die at extremely high temperatures, so things above 25 degrees Celsius or when salinities drop too low. Despite that, I want to emphasize that tolerance doesn't mean optimal, right? So there are sublethal effects if they deal with stresses like low salinity for too long or higher temperatures for too long. And another thing that's important to note is that it's not a sort of universal standard. Various populations of green crabs have varying tolerances, and there's been quite a lot of evidence of their ability to sort of adapt, particularly here on the West Coast. We've seen pretty rapid adaptation to temperatures in terms of cold tolerance. So that could affect things in the future when it comes to climate change. Apologies, my mouse is being finicky. There we go. In terms of how we expect them to respond to reproduction, it's really kind of a mixed bag to interpret. On the one hand, when there's warmer water, we do see decreased fecundity with green crabs. They lay fewer eggs. But when it's warmer, that means that conditions are such that green crabs can actually reproduce more than once a year. So they can create this sort of egg clutch you see here. And so there may be sort of a counterbalance, right? You may be producing fewer eggs, but if you're reproducing more than once a year, you may have more eggs than before, you may have equivalent, it's hard to say. Lower salinity has been associated with reducing that fecundity. And also we just find fewer green crabs. And I should point out the name European green crab very broadly. They're from, say, Portugal, parts of Europe, Norway, even down as far south as North Africa is where they're from originally. And speaking of range, this figure here is posted up by NOAA Alaska. It's the most up-to-date. Unfortunately, there has been an expansion and detection of European green crab in southern Alaska in last year. That's the furthest north they've been found on the Pacific coast. And in terms of how climate change may affect their range, I want to think about it both locally and globally. From a local perspective, Warming temperatures may allow them to access cold areas where they were sort of cold limited, particularly where you have stronger influx of fresh water. They may move into sort of more upstream areas. Again, they can tolerate lower salinities to a degree. They also might move to local areas based on declines of native predators. Things like the red rock crab, which consume green crabs, don't handle temperature increases nearly as well. And so they would likely reduce predation pressure in those areas. Another thing I want to point out is if we look at sort of the climate change modeling and we assume only a 2 degrees Celsius increase in water temperature, there is this potential for further expansion up the coast. Again, we've already seen them reach up to the southern edges of Alaska, and it's not at all unlikely that they'll move further north. But one thing that's also particularly interesting is that this temperature increase isn't sufficient, that we think it's actually going to constrict their range. Because if temperatures get high enough, we'd expect them to not be in those areas anymore. But these smaller changes will not be sufficient to kind of have that constricting effect. But it's important to note that this isn't simple, right? So I'm giving a few examples, and believe me, there's a lot of research on a lot of these aspects. But the bottom line is a lot of these things interact as well. So for example, the larvae of the green crab are vulnerable to low salinities, but it's been found that when temperatures are higher, some populations can counteract that effect. And another issue is things like female green crabs, when there's low oxygen levels, say as a result of high levels of CO2, they will try to aerate and ventilate their eggs. But that signal to do that is actually affected by pH. So you have this effect of decreasing oxygen levels, and ocean acidification could lead to the loss of that particular behavior, or at least difficulty in triggering it. Now let's talk a little bit about sort of the impacts of green crabs and how we think they might change. One thing that is likely to happen is that as temperatures increase, their metabolic rate will also increase. And there's been evidence that shows that green crabs consume more as their metabolic rate goes up. So they're probably going to try to eat more as temperatures increase. But they also get worse in some cases at detecting prey. The pH changes in the water affects their ability to detect prey signals, and actually can affect the musculature of their claws and make them weaker. But on the flip side also, some prey may become weaker, thinner shells, poor ability to detect predators. It may impact their behavioral avoidance behavior as well. So it's a sort of push and pull, hard to say exactly what we might expect to happen. One thing that can be said is that in certain studies, they found green crabs will preferentially eat food that shows signs of stress. The thought is that, if they're stressed, their defenses aren't so good, and so they're much more vulnerable prey. On a larger scale, we expect that the green crabs will probably have a larger impact on food webs. As I mentioned, if they're doing increased foraging, eating more, they're going to be eating more prey, thus affecting sort of prey availability for other organisms, affecting the local communities. Another thing that's expected is they'll be burrowing more for prey. And that will lead to the uprooting of eelgrass, which initially obviously will reduce eelgrass abundance, but also can affect things like sedimentation and nutrient cycling in the long term. So to get to kind of the thing I'm sure most of you are here for, talk very briefly about management challenges related to this. From what we can tell, it seems that the sort of high tolerances and the adaptations of green crabs will make them fairly resistant to a lot of climate change impacts. I'm not saying they won't be stressed. I'm not saying that their populations may not decline, but they are sort of in a better situation than a lot of the native crabs, if we think of things like the red rock and Dungeness, which are more vulnerable to those sorts of changes. It needs to be pointed out, though, that a lot more work needs to be done looking at sort of how these different stressors interact. It's also possible that the impacts and range of green crabs will increase as a result of climate change. And I'm always a big advocate for long-term standardized data so that we can really see when changes occur. If we don't have a clear picture of what's going on now, we really can't have a clear picture of how things are changing over time. And lastly, in terms of what we're actually capable of, if we're finding sort of a spread of green crab, or even just a maintenance of the current levels of green crab, we are going to be much more limited in our resources and time and effort. We're going to, if you think about the state as a whole or any federal agency, we're going to be dealing with multiple climate change issues at a time. So even if everything stays the same in terms of green crab abundance and impact, we are going to have to think very carefully about how we address and target green crab management. So it's very likely that we are going to need to very focus on specific locations that are of the highest priority to do action, rather than the ability to sort of tackle every single challenge everyone's going to be facing at once. So it's just an important thing for us to think about as we go along. This is a very, very brief overview of everything I can talk about. I cut out about 20 slides, I can guarantee you. But if anyone's interested in reading more about this, particularly more technical aspects, this book just came out. My old academic advisor, Catherine de Rivera from UC Davis, actually wrote this particular chapter on climate change and multiple stressors for green crabs. And with that, I want to say thanks, and I'll be quiet so we can move on to the next video.
Thank you, Brian. Let me pull up my schedule here. Our next speaker is Casey McCormack, and Casey is joining us from Idaho Fish and Game. And again, please feel free to add questions to the chat. We'll have one more speaker. We have Casey, and then we'll open it up for the panel discussion. So yes, thank you. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Casey.
Sounds good. Can everybody see my screen okay?
I'm not seeing anything.
Okay.
Okay, so that's your
There we go.
PowerPoint. Yep.
There it goes. How about now?
Looks good.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name's Casey McCormack. I'm the regional diversity biologist in the Idaho Panhandle for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. And I'm just going to talk about some of the efforts we have to try to slow the expansion of the American bullfrog through removal and habitat restoration in the Idaho Panhandle and southern Canada. So invasive bullfrogs have unfortunately established themselves in North Idaho. This became kind of evident in 2013, 2014, when we conducted a project called the Multi-Species Baseline Initiative, which involved conducting amphibian surveys across 826 sites in northern Idaho and parts of Washington. There we found bullfrogs in many of our lowland valleys throughout the area. And since then, anecdotal evidence suggests they are continuing to expand and reproduce successfully and expand to new habitats within the Panhandle. And this expansion is unfortunately likely exacerbated by climate change, as these frogs seem to thrive in our warmer waters in the valleys, as opposed to the cold adapted native amphibians that we have in northern Idaho. So these northern bullfrogs, unfortunately, are a major threat to our native amphibians. They spread disease such as chytrid fungus, and they can outcompete and displace our native amphibians as well as prey upon them, as well as other native species. So usually if bullfrogs become prevalent, our native species aren't doing so well in those same areas. One particular species especially vulnerable is the northern leopard frog, which is historically found through much of the US and Canada, but they have been experiencing significant declines in the West in the last few decades. That is especially the case in northern Idaho, where they've been extirpated locally from the northern part of the state. We kind of realized this through that same project I mentioned earlier, where we didn't really detect any northern leopard frogs, unfortunately, across the northern Panhandle, even though we have historic observations of them being documented previously and have museum specimens verifying that they did once inhabit the Idaho Panhandle. There is one remaining Rocky Mountain northern leopard frog population, which is probably those frogs that are most similar to those that used to be in Idaho. This is an endangered population in British Columbia, with one extant population existing in the Creston Valley Wildlife Management Area, just about 20 kilometers north of Idaho, the kind of the Kootenai Valley area. You can see on the right, there used to be historic locations of these frogs all over eastern British Columbia and northern Idaho. And now there's just the one existing extant population marked by that yellow triangle kind of in the middle of that map on the right, probably kind of hard to see, but yeah, unfortunately, very endangered particular population of this one frog species. Thankfully, British Columbia has been conducting northern leopard frog recovery efforts in BC, trying to protect this population, including egg mass protection, captive rearing, various studies, habitat protection and enhancement to try to improve their chances of reproduction and survival. And then an exciting recent translocation effort to a new location in Kimberley, British Columbia, which I think just started last year, and kind of just seeing the results of that now. In addition to those efforts to focus on trying to preserve or recover the northern leopard frog in British Columbia, there's also been extensive bullfrog control in conjunction with this to protect the northern leopard frog. These have involved visual and call surveys, audio recorder deployment, and then systematic removal through various methods. This is usually done at night by a team of folks in canoes or rafts, as you can kind of see in these photos on the left. This has primarily been done in Canada, but we've been doing similar work in Idaho as well. You can kind of see some of the results from this work in the Crescent area. The Canadian-US borders and the southern edge of these pictures on the left, and these dots represent where frogs have been observed and or removed since 2019. So since then, about a total of over 1,000 frogs have been detected and or removed from these areas. Many of these from Idaho, actually, but they seem to be more prevalent in Idaho and have become less, or not quite as prevalent in the British Columbia side of the border, thankfully, but they unfortunately seem to be still making their way north. So bullfrog control in Idaho specifically, we haven't been quite as involved as British Columbia has been, basically just due to lack of resources, but we've been periodically doing removal efforts since 2015, kind of doing the same methods I just mentioned previously. Most of these have occurred at our boundary Smith Creek WMA, which is managed by Idaho Department of Fish and Game, right on the US-Canada border. Kind of provides like a good kind of choke point in the valley where we can hopefully reduce the movement of bullfrogs moving south to north across the Canadian border. In addition to those removal efforts, we've also started a project called the Bees to Bears Climate Adaptation Project, which initiated around 2018 in conjunction with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative and other contributors and agencies. This was to benefit 6 species of greatest conservation need. Some of them you can kind of see here, but the northern leopard frog was listed as one of those. That project has involved various portions, including the construction of 6.5 acres of cool air refugia structures to try to reduce temperatures and increase soil moisture. The planting of 50,000 native plants over 40 hectares across the WMA that I mentioned earlier. Should verify this is all happening at the boundary Smith Creek WMA I just mentioned. And then in addition to those portions of the project, we've also engaged in hydrological restoration on the boundary Smith Creek WMA. This has involved 1.2 kilometers of ephemeral stream bed and 4 ephemeral ponds being constructed, kind of based on where we historically thought streams and ponds probably occurred in the past prior to this WMA being turned into farmland in the 1900s. So trying to get it back to where it used to be, kind of the lowland flooded habitat it probably was historically. The idea here is also that it should provide ideal habitat for our native amphibians, but not for bullfrogs, as our native amphibians can fully develop within 1 year. And so an ephemeral pond is typically good habitat as they can fully reproduce and metamorphose before the end of the season, while bullfrogs typically take 2 seasons. And so these ephemeral stream beds and ponds hopefully provide habitat for our native amphibians, but not for our bullfrogs. This particular work was funded as a part of another grant specifically to benefit the northern leopard frog with partners Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, BC Ministry of Forest, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and Yellowstone to Yukon, as well as other contributors and folks being involved. So and you can kind of see our ephemeral stream bed being built here in this photo. In addition to that, we had a feasibility assessment done for the recovery of the northern leopard frog in the Kootenai Valley, basically looking at the possibility of conducting a translocation or reintroduction effort to the northern Idaho, and kind of looking at the options of doing that and the resources that would be required to make this a successful effort. So that was conducted by the Wilder Institute, part of the Calgary Zoo, and so very interesting, but we haven't engaged in any translocation efforts yet. So where are we now? Basically, bullfrog removal efforts in Canada seem to be making an impact, going off of the tracking that the folks in Canada have been doing and all their in-depth monitoring. Although things can change year to year, it's only been happening for a few years. So here in Idaho, we're planning to continue to do bullfrog control in Idaho and continue to coordinate with British Columbia, especially since they've played a huge role in actually coming down and helping us with some of our bullfrog removal efforts as well. We also plan to integrate bullfrog control with our WMA management for the Boundary Smith Creek WMA. So if we're doing any wetland maintenance, like draining our wetlands to control cattails, we might use those opportunities to try to remove bullfrog as well, or at least make sure that we're not moving them to new locations when we're draining ponds, etc. Still kind of early to see some of the effectiveness of some of these restoration efforts, but we're hoping that we'll see native amphibians start to use them. And the northern leopard frog relocation effort in Kimberley, BC, I mentioned, sounds promising from the last report I heard. And so we're hoping we'll see some progress there and have some more tools to work with moving forward. As far as lessons learned, coordination is key. As you can see, this has been an effort by many people, by many agencies, and it wouldn't have happened if people weren't in good communication and willing to work with each other across agencies and borders. Idaho Fish and Game is really just a small part of what I've talked about today. Done a lot, and so sometimes it feels like it's good to take one step at a time. We're still trying to kind of fix some of the issues we had with some of our earlier projects I mentioned, and also being patient as these restoration efforts and these control efforts take a long time, especially to see any major improvements. So, and hopefully someday, if things go well, and we're able to move bullfrogs and translocation efforts continue to go well, we might have the opportunity to reintroduce the northern leopard frog, the Boundary Smith Creek WMA someday. I just want to acknowledge that, like I mentioned, I'm a very small part of this. There's been a lot of agencies and folks involved, including my predecessor, Michael Lucid, who kind of got a lot of this work off the ground several years ago. And so I just wanted to express that this is once again, an effort by many different people, and that's a key for all this work to actually happen. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was really informative. We have several minutes if the other speakers wouldn't mind joining. We have a couple of questions in the chat for each of you. And let's see, is Cheryl still here? Yeah, awesome. So the first question is for Cheryl, and they're curious, what aspects of first foods are currently most threatened by invasive species? They gave the example of, whether the pressure was primarily on medicinal plants and food resources, or things like impacts to range shifts on, game species, or that sort of thing.
I think right now it's invasive grasses that are impacting our food resources. When I first started working for the tribe, our elders and the gatherers have shared that concern that these annual grasses, cheatgrass, Medusa head, now ventonata, are choking out the kind of our gathering areas. And I think that also impacts our wildlife habitat as well. And that's specifically on the reservation that I'm talking about, that we're seeing those impacts from annual grasses.
Okay, thank you. And then we have a couple questions for, actually, I'll ask another one for Cheryl real quick. Someone just asked, how do invasives impact cultural practices other than foods gathering?
I guess the impact of like the disturbance regimes like fires are, impacting, although fire was a natural thing that we used on the landscape. It's just that cycle back to invasive species again and impacting the landscape, the poor air quality, that's impacting the community as well.
Thank you. Okay, this question is for Casey. And they asked, has anyone determined where the bullfrogs in northern Idaho are coming from? And they're curious if there's a way to reduce the number of frogs being introduced from other areas.
Yeah, I think we're pretty confident, like a lot of other places in the West, that they were probably unfortunately introduced through the food trade. There's at one time there was supposed to be bullfrog farms, I guess, to produce frog legs, and I think we suspect that the ones in northern Idaho came from those locations historically. Don't really have good tracking of how they got here in the first place, but that's our kind of our assumption. And at this point, they're unfortunately become pretty well established across the Idaho Panhandle, and they're pretty prolific in many of our smaller lakes and rivers, or at least the warmer ones in the Panhandle. And without significant resources, I don't think we're going to be able to knock those populations down. And so the example I showed was really focusing on one spot where we can make a positive impact to try to protect those northern leopard frogs. But as of right now, we don't really have plans to reduce their populations in other part of the Panhandle. They're just kind of part of the landscape now, unfortunately. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I am familiar with one study that looked at the genetic source, genetic history of bullfrogs here in the Northwest. I don't know if that study extended into Idaho or not, but I believe they found that most of the source populations for bullfrogs here in the Northwest come from the Mississippi River area. So unsurprising, I guess.
Yeah, I think they're definitely obviously an eastern a native species in the east. And then, yeah, how they got here, it seems like, as far as I've been told, is basically probably movement from there by people, of course, unfortunately.
Frog legs were tasty back in the day, apparently.
Yeah.
Another question for Casey was, if your control efforts miss a few bullfrogs, are you back to where you started in a couple of years as they reproduce?
That's a good question. And I think as you get further north and closer to that northern leopard frog population, that very well could be the case. And so my counterparts in Canada that are really working hard on this, like if they get reports of a bullfrog being further north than they realize, or making a big jump closer to that northern leopard frog population, it really is all hands on deck to try to find that one frog, because it only takes one successful reproduction and one egg mass from bullfrogs to be introduced in that pond the northern leopard frogs are, to really make a drastic impact. So potentially, yes, like it's unfortunately could change very quickly if bullfrogs get past it. And so I think it's really important that those folks in Canada have had such a significant effort with a team that's really out there hitting that whole valley really hard and really in depth throughout the summer to prevent that from happening. But yeah, potentially it can take only one bullfrog to really mess things up and threaten that population up north.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to pitch a question to each of you, and maybe I'll give Brian the floor to talk first, but there's general curiosity about, like, what has been the most challenging aspect of accounting for climate change in your work? So, how does it compare to other maybe non-climate related challenges that you deal with?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the challenge is always kind of the high level of uncertainty of the exact result that we're going to see. So we know that it's going to be an issue, and we know that it's going to complicate matters, but exactly in what way and how is still kind of up in the air. As I mentioned, we're not even entirely sure how green crab would respond to climate change here in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a very well studied species. Like, there's been a ton of work on green crabs overall. And so what it just means is we have to be aware that we're going to face these challenges and be adaptable and flexible and be looking out for these different changes so we can make effective management decisions when they do occur. So.
Cheryl or Casey, do you want to answer that one as well?
Yeah, I could add. I thought it was kind of interesting that a good example maybe that kind of addresses that is that Bees to Bears climate adaptation project I mentioned. Ironically, it seems like climate change maybe had an impact on the success of that during the initiation of that project. And so the first year after planting, when we really were hoping things would take off, was the year we had that heat dome in the Northwest, and it got to be over 110 degrees Fahrenheit or around there at that WMA, which is of course unheard of in that area, especially in June. And so we were literally dealing with climate change, what felt like climate change impacts, while we were trying to conduct a climate adaptation project. The way to cope with that, I don't know if we really had a good answer other than prepare for the unexpected. And I think kind of one thing I alluded to was like, give yourself, even though it seems like we're in a rush, give yourself plenty of time to do the job right and assume that a project might take several years, because if we would have planned ahead that we could have had one bad summer, we might have actually had a lot better planting success by being able to delay that to the following year. That's easier said than done with grants and funding and planning. I mean, that never happens, but it's one thing we learned is it felt like we lost a lot of productive work because that one season really made it hard for that project to take off the ground. So I guess thinking about climate change impacts on your project while you're trying to do a climate focused project is something that we've thought about a little bit.
Yeah. Cheryl, did you want to add anything to that?
Just kind of similar to Casey, where, we've, doing our, management, specific like range management for like our range inventory. The year that we did it was a year of that heat dome as well. And so we were comparing it to the previous 10 years that we had, all the work, and just I think the variability in our climate, I guess we have to accept that we're going to have that now in the future. So it wasn't very comparable from the 2009 to the year that we did it. And also that same year, with our invasive species management, the weeds just exploded that year. And so that kind of just set us back. I think it's just, having to address and adapt to those changes within our management.
Yeah, I've heard that from a lot of folks, that one of the big challenges is, like, traditionally when we've done, restoration work, there is some kind of baseline that we're looking to use as a reference. And with climate change, we don't really have a great baseline because things are changing so rapidly and variably, if that's a word. So it's that moving target, right? Okay, well, we have like 2 minutes left, so I'm just gonna pose this question. Is biocontrol research an option or a funding priority for any of the projects that you three are working on?
I guess I'll answer that. Yeah, we utilize biocontrols. We're working with University of Idaho for one for common cupina and ODA for yellow star thistle. So we're hoping to implement those on the reservation to help us address our invasive species management. So hopefully we'll see some good results with that. I mean, it takes many years for us to see the results, and it's just part of the toolkit, but I'm hoping that we'll have some success with biocontrols.
I would say that we certainly aren't eliminating the possibility that you could try for biocontrol. Historically, there hasn't really been any evidence of a strong biocontrol agent for green crabs. It's very tricky to find something that fits very well and then to go through the entire process. And it's important to remember, biocontrol will kind of help stabilize a level, but it won't lead to sort of a complete removal of a species or like really taking them down to really low levels, which is what most of the management efforts we're trying to do, is to get rid of as many green crabs as we can. And so it's not our highest priority, but it's certainly something that we have open and are willing to accept like suggestions and thoughts and proposals related to if they're well-founded. So.
Yeah, I think something we haven't really thought specifically about in the work that I mentioned, but kind of as Brian alluded to, definitely be open to suggestions or new research that might suggest that, maybe another avenue is open. We'd definitely be fine with that, but haven't looked into it specifically.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you all so much. There may be some other questions for you sprinkled in the chat if you don't mind taking a look before you leave. Otherwise, we're going to take a short 5-minute break. It's 10:25 now, and we'll return at 10:30 with the second part to this breaking down barriers session. So thank you again to our speakers, and we hope to see you again in another 5 minutes. All right, so thank you all for rejoining us for part 2 of our Breaking Down Barriers session. I will go ahead, hopefully most of you are rejoining. I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. We have 3 more speakers, same as the previous session, and then we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the panel at the end of the session for the panel discussion. So our first speaker is Jessica LaBelle, and she is the Invasive Species Program Specialist for the Washington Invasive Species Council. And she's also the facilitator for the multi-agency Spotted Lanternfly Preparedness Advisory Group. So I will turn it over to Jessica, and we got your slides, so you're ready to go.
Excellent. Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Jessica Bell. I'm with the Washington Invasive Species Council, and today we're going to talk about spotted lanternfly, which is not yet in Washington State, but what we're preparing for, a little bit about it, and then cultural impacts of it, which is a topic that hasn't been touched on a lot. So a little overview of spotted lanternfly. It is an insect in the plant hopper family, and it's a piercing, sucking insect. So it doesn't pierce or suck people. Thankfully, it's harmless to handle. But if you see that picture of the insect on its back there, it has outlined that proboscis, and it actually uses that to pierce the stem or trunk of plants and trees. So it's native to China, Bangladesh, and Vietnam, and it's been introduced accidentally and is considered invasive in South Korea, Japan, and the US, which is what we're going to be talking about. They are generalist feeders. They feed on over 170 known species of trees and plants, and that number is climbing as they move into new areas and more research is being conducted. And they have an interesting relationship with another invasive species called the tree of heaven. And tree of heaven is an invasive tree that was originally an ornamental and introduced in a lot of places deliberately to control erosion because it's such a fast-growing tree. But in Washington, it's classified as a Class C weed, meaning it's either widespread or of agricultural concern, and in this case, it is both. But it's sprinkled throughout North America, so there are little pockets kind of everywhere. And spotted lanternfly really has an interesting relationship with this tree in that it doesn't need it to survive, but when it's exposed to tree of heaven at some point in its lifetime, it can become more reproductively viable and hardier. So the damage that spotted lanternfly causes is just by feeding. So as I mentioned, they're a piercing, sucking insect. They're sap suckers, essentially. So they feed on the phloem of the plant, or the sap, and that in itself weakens the plant. But what they also do is they continually defecate as they feed. And that's a very sugary substance that's called honeydew. And honeydew promotes the growth of sooty mold. And you can see some of these pictures there with honeydew coating leaves and then sooty mold. Sooty mold decreases the plant's ability to photosynthesize. It attracts other pest insects, and it leaves the plant susceptible to diseases. And so the weakened plant will often die. That picture on the left or on the right there shows kind of the swarming behavior that spotted lanternfly will do, or just a ton of them will congregate on a nice food source. So this is a map updated in June showing the current distribution of spotted lanternfly in the United States. This is where there are active infestations. Currently in 15 states. The initial detection was in Pennsylvania in 2014. So this is all from one single introduction, believed to be a contaminated shipment of stone with spotted lanternfly egg masses on it coming from Asia. And this is the result just a few years later. So this is a very fast spreading pest. And even though it's not, infested on our coast yet, on the West Coast, it is something that we're very concerned about and we want to be prepared for. So there was a habitat suitability study conducted, and this shows the areas in Washington state where spotted lanternfly could readily establish, red being the most suitable areas and then white being the least. And this is a concern, as you see, because it's that I-5 corridor and then kind of our Eastern Washington breadbasket, which covers a lot of our agricultural land and, you know, a lot of tribal and indigenous lands. And I have listed the prey plants here, again, over 170 species and counting, but some of the notable ones we're concerned about are going to be grapes, hops, cherries, peaches, almonds, pines, other conifers, hardwoods, and then culturally significant ethnobotanicals. And so if you think of that in terms of this map, it's pretty concerning. So again, they're not here yet. That is the good news. They have difficulty really moving around on their own, but they do hitchhike on man-made surfaces, and basically anything that moves can move an invasive species, whether that's your vehicle coming from an infested area, your outdoor furniture, shipping. You know, we're very, very transcontinental and global at this point, as the pandemic has shown us how much we rely on shipments. And so that is a concern for moving invasive species. We have had dead specimens found in California and Oregon, so it is possible for them to get here. So I always like to talk about reporting when I'm talking about spotted lanternfly. And it's super important to have the public looking out for these guys and looking out for invasive species in general. There are only so many invasive species professionals, and we can't be everywhere at once. So it's really helpful to have eyes across the state. So in Washington, you can report in 3 different ways: by email at pestprogram@agr.wa.gov. You can call the Washington State Department of Agriculture's Pest Program Hotline, 800-443-6684. Or my personal favorite, you can report on your smartphone or tablet using the Washington Invasives app, and that is the Washington Invasive Species Council app. It has a digital field guide. It's free. It's on Apple and Android, and it will go directly to verifiers at these different agencies. If you're in another state, please report with a photo to the state agricultural department. So one of the ways we're preparing for spotted lanternfly is the development of a state action plan that was completed in July. We've received $90,000 from the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection and Quarantine, just a mouthful, but USDA, APHIS, PPQ. And these are all kind of the different modalities that we looked at in that plan. But what I'm going to talk about is going to be potential cultural impacts here. So the Washington State Spotted Lanternfly Action Plan is a first of its kind in that it takes an in-depth focus on cultural impacts and specifically culturally significant ethnobotanicals. And that's more than just first foods. It's traditional medicines, it's plants for shelter making supplies, it's plants used in ceremonies, it's all the different plants that would be significant to tribal nations and indigenous communities. And that we faced a lot of challenges in identifying those. Mostly finding out what those items are. You know, traditional knowledge keepers in these communities have historically very good reasons for keeping that knowledge to themselves, and we didn't want to tread on that. But so our solution was to conduct an in-depth literature review of published culturally significant ethnobotanicals, because that was already out in the world, and then contrast that with known host plants of the spotted lanternfly. And that allows us to also target our outreach to tribal nations and indigenous communities about like what you should be looking out for, why you should care, et cetera, and how it impacts them. We also provided some adaptations to strategy for conducting work in areas that may be significant to tribal nations and indigenous communities. I'm sorry to say that previously the plan of attack was, oh, there's a reservation within 50 miles of our work. We should notify the tribe. And that's really not adequate. Indigenous people historically moved all over the state of Washington. They don't have interests only on reservation lands. And so we consulted with cultural resources staff at the Washington State Recreation Office, Recreation Conservation Office. Sorry, I should know who I work for. They host WISC. And they were extremely helpful. If you have a program that's doing similar work, I strongly suggest that you consult with cultural resources staff. And if you don't have them, get some. They are very worth it. And they had information on in what county you should be alerting different tribes and indigenous peoples to. So better outreach, and has information on more targeted outreach, which is a lot of it, including it in their own language, whether that's Sahaptin or Salishan or whatever language they speak. It's really important not to just be reaching out in English. So just to briefly show you what an issue this could be for culturally significant ethnobotanicals, these are all the different plants that are important to tribal nations and indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest, and that are also prey species of spotted lanternfly. So that's quite a few pretty big ones. And then this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have, and I will yield the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. And the slides are beautiful for it being such kind of a depressing
Thank you.
forward-looking thing. Yeah, thank you so much. And of course, Jessica will be around for questions at the end of our three presentations. So feel free to put questions in the chat if you have them. And our next speaker is Irene Weber. And Irene is a vegetation ecologist for the Washington Department of Natural Resources in their Natural Heritage Program. And so I will cede the floor to Irene whenever you're ready.
Hi, everybody. Just getting my presentation going. Can everybody see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello. Yes, I'm Irene Weber. I work for the Natural Heritage Program. We are a part of the Department of Natural Resources here in Washington State. And I'm here today to talk about a project we're working on about the ecological impact rankings of Washington's non-native plant species. So just to start off a little bit about who we are at the Heritage Program, we are a kind of a scientific group who document the locations of rare species and rare and high quality ecosystems throughout Washington State, and not just on DNR lands. We determine rare plant and ecosystem conservation priorities within Washington, and we also distribute data to guide conservation actions and inform land use decisions to all of our stakeholders within Washington. So how do invasive species impact the work of the Heritage Program? One of the major ways that we look at invasive species with the work that we do is with one of our data projects called ecological integrity assessments. This is where we're looking at the ecological integrity of ecosystems. So essentially how departed from a historical baseline is a plant community on the landscape. And one of the metrics that we look at are invasive and non-native species land cover as a reflection of the site's ecological health. The presence and absence of invasive plants point to a general measure of departure from historic norms, but the extent to which a particular non-native species might impact ecological processes is a bit of a missing puzzle piece for us. So we're concerned about the impact of native species, particularly on natural ecosystems. This is different than impacts of invasive plants on agriculture or horticultural areas. Economic impacts are less measurable than in the aforementioned settings and ecosystems. So this is kind of where what we're looking at is different from like a noxious weed list, because we're not necessarily interested in the economic impacts of it or about its toxicity to livestock, contamination of seed problems, and things like that. So as such, some of the species that we want to look at in this project might not necessarily match all the classic signs of an invasive plant, but they may be altering biological processes in other ways. So we've identified kind of a regional data gap. We need a standardized method to assess the impacts of non-native plants relative to their impact on biodiversity and ecosystem function. So this invasive plant ranking system is a way that we're hoping to address that data gap. So the project goals are to assess the impact of Washington's non-native flora using a systematic protocol that will evaluate the impacts of non-native species on the natural ecosystems rather than in a agricultural or even an urban environment. We want to be able to produce a scientifically defensible list for consistent and objective application. Some of our collaborators on this project have found that such as the Department of Ecology, more regulatory agencies than our program. We're not a regulatory program, but they need something that they can point to say these are the species that we want you to control for in restoration projects or things like that. And so having a list that's more inclusive of species that might not be on a noxious weed list is important to them. We also want to have a repeatable ranking process as new invasive species are introduced or become of concern, or as new information is available. We want to be able to repeat this ranking process and maybe change some of the scores and the threat level of these species. So this project has been ongoing for quite a while with a lot of starts and stops. We are currently in a beginning to start again phase. But this is kind of the general workflow of this project. We're going to design a ranking system. We're reaching out to a bunch of experts across the state to kind of recruit a ranking panel. These are the people who are going to be using their expertise to rank these plants using the ranking system. And then after all of that, we train them, they rank the species. We'll compile the ranks and kind of vet the ranks, and then we'll create species reports for all of the species that have been ranked. So the protocol design for this ranking system, we essentially have 4 different sections. The first 3 sections roll up into the environmental impact rank, and these sections are questions about distribution and abundance. This includes questions about range size, trends in the range, diversity of habitats invaded, questions about biological characteristics of these non-native plants, such as their disturbance tolerance, fecundity, palatability, their shade tolerance, and then their ecological impacts. So this is about how the species might alter community structure, composition, or abiotic processes. These 3 sections will roll up into the environmental impact rank. That's essentially the rank of how impactful the species is on ecosystem and natural areas. We also kind of have a standalone rank, a little bit of a separate ranking process of management difficulty. We found that it would be useful for folks to be able to know, okay, this is very impactful, but the management difficulty is high, or this is very impactful and the management difficulty currently with existing tools is low. So that can help prioritize action. We're going to be using a Survey 123 form that I've designed. So that's just for ease of data collection, and rankers will have the ability to cite their sources and to give a confidence in their rating. So that way we can, there's a lot of data gaps and a lot of research that still needs to be done on a lot of invasive species. So being able to know how confident we are in our ranking will be helpful. Once everybody's ranked the plant species, we will compile those ranks. And this is something we haven't quite nailed down exactly how we want it to look yet, but once everybody's done the rankings, we will compile their ranks and and put it into a bin of extreme to low impact that will help us determine which species are of the most concern in Washington in relation to their ecological impacts. Then we were going to produce reports. These are some examples from other heritage programs across the US that have done similar projects. Alaska and Virginia in particular is what's shown here. And we'll have the information available to the public for these species. More than anything, this is kind of a data gathering exercise where we can compile both published and unpublished data about all of these species and how that might impact natural ecosystems and make that available to folks throughout the state. Kind of where the nexus of climate change is with this is, as I just said, it's a data gathering process. Like we learned in Lindsay's talk yesterday, there's a lot of overlap between invasive traits and climate adaptability traits. So being able to kind of compile a lot of that information may help us identify species that may be a particular concern with climate change. We're also collecting information on the types of ecosystems that each individual species might invade. And that kind of ties into another project that we work on here at the Heritage Program, which are climate change vulnerability index assessments. We do this both for individual species and for habitats. So if in part of our data gathering process with this invasive ranking tool, we find that particular habitats are being invaded by a species, and then this other project, our habitat climate change vulnerability assessment project, finds that those habitats are particularly susceptible to climate change, there may be a nexus there for some restoration or conservation work to be done in those areas. We're also collecting data on whether invasive species impact a specific native plant or animal. So then the nexus between how those species interact with climate change would be something interesting to look at as well. So our hopeful outcomes of this project are a standardized ecological assessment of non-native plants. We can assist with the Noxious Weed Control Board and the Invasive Species Council and other partners in prioritizing some of their work and identifying species that may become problematic under future climate scenarios. This slide you'll recognize from earlier, but we are just kind of in this training and ranking phase of this project right now. So I am just diving back into it after a long field season. So just kind of getting the gears going on this again. But if you have any questions or want to be involved in this project, you're welcome to reach out to me. My contact information is there, and I will pass it off to the next person.
Thank you, Irene. We have one more speaker for this session. Lori Carr is up next. And Lori is the development coordinator for the Central Kootenai Invasive Species Society. So whenever you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Okay, what's happening here? This is what I want to, okay.
Yep, we see it.
Okay, is it the full screen?
It's the full screen, yeah.
Okay. Great, thank you. Yep, I'm Lori Carr, and I wanted to share with you today one of our education programs that we've had quite a bit of success with, and that is the Eco Garden Project. Before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge that I am joining from the unceded territories of the Ktunaxa, the Syilx, the Secwépemc, and the Sinixt First Nations, and on behalf of the Central Kootenai Invasive Species Society, we are a nonprofit with a mission to protect our ecosystems and communities by preventing and reducing the harmful impacts of invasive species. We are in the Central Kootenai region, which is about 3 hours straight north of Spokane. We're inland, kind of between Vancouver and Calgary. We're in an inland temperate rainforest. And so the Eco Garden Project is aimed at gardeners, and it's also aimed at supporting residents to protect ecosystems in their own backyard. And so fittingly, the project began in my backyard. So I was designing a new garden and I was wondering what I should plant. I was looking at some cedar trees that my landscaper had suggested I put in, and then some mountain ash that I had bought from a nursery. And I had some misgivings about these plants. I wasn't sure the mountain ash was actually native. And I know that wildfires, are a huge concern in our community. So I had a lot of questions about which were the best plants. I obviously wanted to support wildlife. And so I started digging into, plant lists and information. And I thought, this is going to be a big project, figuring out which are the best plants to grow in my particular area. And I thought, if I'm going to be doing this project, I might as well do it for everybody, because I cannot be the only person that is asking these questions. So the Eco Garden project had 3 objectives. First one is to address climate change. The second is to reduce barriers to behavior change, which we are encouraging people to plant native and non-invasive plants, and to broaden the messaging around invasive plants in general. So I just wanted to give a shout out to these great publications from the Northeast Risk and their management challenges, because at this time I was thinking about how can we address climate change as an organization, and I came across these publications that were talking about native plants and nativars and sleeper species, and got me thinking, and could see that promoting native plants was a way that we could encourage people to address climate change. So this project then morphed into one of our climate change initiatives. So the second objective was to reduce barriers to behavior change, because we wanted people to plant climate smart plants, which is basically native plants, but there's a bunch of other parts about that, primarily with drought tolerance and fire tolerance, etc. So I mentioned before about existing plant lists, and there are quite a few of them. And there's the Fire Smart list, there's our local Water Smart list, there's the Xerces pollinator list, there's the David Suzuki monarch butterfly list, there's the Invasive Species Council of BC Grow Me Instead list. And looking at all of these lists, I wanted to make one that was very clear for our area, that lists the plants that would thrive in our region and also that are not invasive. So I got a group of local gurus, they're horticulturists and they're pollinator experts, and we put together a list of plants that are specific for our region. So that was addressing the first part, or one of the barriers to behavior change, which is which plant should I be planting if I want to support wildlife and meet all these objectives and garden in a changing climate. And the second part of that barrier was making a list of suppliers. So native plant, finding native plants can be very, very tricky. Our local nurseries don't sell native plants. And so we have the native plant list, but we also have a non-invasive horticultural list that people can bring to their local nursery. But for the native plants list, we then provided a list of suppliers for each plant. And we're really lucky because we actually do have 2 groups that are growing native plants. So it actually made this project not so hard. And what the project ended up looking like is we have a web page on our website, and we have our searchable plant lists. You can also download the plant lists, and all the details of each plant from a gardening perspective is on that Excel spreadsheet. So that's also searchable. Then we have our printed material, we have a brochure, we have our top recommended plants that are printed out. And then we put these in nurseries with the brochures and signage, and we also provide the printed lists at our outreach booth. So our third objective, which was to broaden the messaging, to create positive messaging, and to also broaden the don't plant invasive messaging to prevention of the next invasive plant. We do have this fantastic program. I've seen it, other people have different versions of it, the Grow Me Instead. Here's an invasive plant, this is the way you should plant instead, except that often the invasive plants that we have in our garden, we did not put there on purpose. So we wanted to broaden the messaging to think about any plant that you put in your garden. think very carefully about it. Is it aggressive? Is it a superseder? Could it become invasive? You know, look it up. And then also we made this picture brochure that looked at invasive species that gardeners might find in their garden or that are being sold in local nurseries. So again, this is just very locally focused outreach material. One of the side benefits of this was really creating this very positive messaging and image for ourselves. There's a lot of negative wording around invasive species. You know, they're aliens, they've invaded. We have these pictures like people think we just want to get out and spray all the plants with herbicides and kill the bees. And so in order to turn our image around a little bit, we now have this very accessible program. It's clear that we love plants and we want you to plant them, and we're all in this together. And we may be looking at it from a different viewpoint than somebody else, but we are ultimately all trying to protect our ecosystems. So some of the results that came out of this project, which were a little bit surprising, was that gardeners, which are the target audience of this project, are very, very keen and very large. And we've gotten the most participation we've ever had in any of our presentations or workshops with our gardening focused material. The EcoGarden webpage is on our top 10 hits, and the printed resources are extremely popular. Again, it's in our top 5 outreach materials. And we've also created fantastic partnerships with our native plant colleagues. And we now work very closely with them on our restoration projects. And it's also made us rethink how we restore, planting more forbs rather than just grasses, thinking about pollinators and wildlife. And so it's improved our restoration practices and our outreach to the public. And so that's just a quick overview of the project. And I would like to thank our funders, which were primarily our regional districts of Central Kootenai and Kootenai Boundary, as well as the Columbia Basin Trust. That's it. I think it's now questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Lori. Yes, please feel free to add questions into the chat. We've been collecting them as we go along, so I have a few. But I will go ahead and just ask that our 3 speakers please rejoin us on video. And I will go ahead and pose some questions to you. I'll grab this first one from Patrick for Lori. Patrick's asking, do you have any recommendations on native tree nurseries? We are looking into future plantings to offset potential impacts of the emerald ash borer.
Yes, so our suppliers that we have listed on our page are for the province of BC, or more specifically for our region. I don't know where you are, but if you send me your information, I can send you some links. But yeah, I don't have anything for the States, if that helps, or doesn't help, rather.
So they're located in Portland.
Yeah, it just, you know, it required a bit of digging. It was surprising how much time it took to go through all the suppliers and to phone them up and make sure they're actually selling true native plants and to gather that list. Yeah.
I imagine. Okay, so Jessica, this question is for you. Someone asked, how do you feel like recruiting community members to smash lanternflies in New York is working or may resonate with possible control efforts in the Northwest?
Well, we definitely aren't there yet in the Pacific Northwest, you know, because we don't have it yet, obviously. But I have noticed that particularly in New York, they've done an excellent job with public outreach. And, you know, like I mentioned before, outreach is really so critical. Citizen and community involvement is really so critical in getting ahead of invasive species. And New York in particular, I mean, they've had segments on Saturday Night Live, on Jimmy Fallon, on Jimmy Kimmel about spotted lanternfly. If you haven't seen the SNL one, you need to just Google like Saturday Night Live spotted lanternfly. It's amazing. It has some swears in it, so like don't do it on your work computer. But But yeah, I think it's always great to get the communities involved, and hopefully we don't get to the point where we have so many spotted lanternfly that we have to ask people to stomp them in the street.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't come to that. I asked this question actually, Jessica, during your talk, because I was really interested in, just given the emerald ash borer experience that we had last summer and now, does Washington have an early detection plan? And you did share your action plan, so I appreciate that. I'm very curious to read it. Someone asked though, they asked where and when were dead spotted lanternfly detected in Oregon?
Yeah, so that was in October of 2020, and they were both shipments originating in Pennsylvania. One was in a shipment of planters and ceramic pots going into Benton County, and the other was in a shipment of like new shipping boxes. Like, you know, strangely, we ship shipping boxes without things in them, to Marion County. So both October 2020, they were both dead on arrival and dry. And so that's super important with insects. It doesn't cause as much alarm as if they were like juvenile forms or eggs or something that was viable.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So another question for Jessica, do you have targeted outreach to those shipping companies? And have you been able to get that message across? How is it received?
Yeah, we actually, because shipping can be such a pathway for invasive species, there's kind of just like a national targeted outreach to shipping companies. We at the Washington Invasive Species Council are part of like the Don't Pack a Pest campaign, making sure when you're moving that things don't get moved around. I believe like umove.com and U-Haul, they have different things about invasive species on their websites. Including like spongy moth checklists, basically just checking for anything that's not supposed to be there. And yeah, we do consider that a pathway, so we do targeted outreach, especially when you know, there's a detection. Then we ramp that up.
That's good to know. Okay, Lori, a couple questions back for you. Do any of the counties in your area have a backyard habitat certification program? Oh, okay, you just answered that. Never mind.
Oh, I just answered it. Yeah. No, we don't. I would love to get something like that going.
Yeah. Do you reach out to local growers, like to encourage them to use native plants?
We did reach out to one of our largest nurseries, and that was one of the side benefits of this, is we got a conversation going between our native plant suppliers and our local nursery, and they are new owners, and that's often, you know, the time to create better partnerships with somebody is you look for these opportunities and partnerships, and they have expressed interest. So we will see what happens with that. As everything, it takes a while for these things to get going, but I do very much hope to see native plants in our local nursery. That was always the dream.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Irene, a question for you. How are you recruiting experts for your impacts assessments? If someone wanted to be a part of it, for example, how would they get involved?
Sure. Folks can just send me an email. I'll stick my email in the chat if they're interested in getting involved. We've been reaching out to a lot of like the botanical experts throughout the state. We've been reaching out to various land managers and people who have more of kind of a boots on the ground interest in invasive plants. So I'm really trying to encourage our program to reach out to a broader diversity of folks. We tend to have kind of people who are in our pocket who we talk to all the time, but I think there's a lot of expertise out there that isn't being tapped into that we could really use. So anybody who has some specific knowledge, because these plants act very differently across our state. There's a lot of geographic and ecological diversity in Washington. So it's important that we get experts, a broad range of experts.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, unless there are any other questions in the chat, I'll give us an awkward pause for a few seconds. But I do want to let you all know that we will be taking a short break until 11:30 to rejoin for our next and final session of the symposium, which will be a more like forward-looking, looking into the future, what's the new science, and what are the new opportunities. So I hope you're able to rejoin us. I don't see any other questions popping up, so I'll go ahead and let you all break, and hopefully we'll see you back at 11:30.